When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, thousands of tanks lay scattered across Europe. Some sat abandoned in fields, their fuel exhausted, and crews vanished. Others crowded into makeshift depots, hastily painted with Allied markings. The most feared armoured force in the world had fallen silent, but the story of these machines was far from over. What became of the Panthers and Tigers that once dominated the battlefield? Where did Hitler's massive tank fleet disappear to after the Reich collapsed? In this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. The scale of Germany's tank production during World War II was staggering. Between 1939 and 1945, German factories churned out approximately 46,000 armoured fighting vehicles, including medium tanks, heavy tanks, and tank destroyers. This enormous fleet represented billions of Reichsmarks in investments and countless hours of labour from both German workers and enslaved populations across occupied territories. By the war's end, Allied forces found themselves in possession of a technological treasure trove, from obsolete Panzer IIs to cutting-edge Tiger II. King Tigers equipped with 80 80mm guns capable of defeating any Allied tank at range. The question facing military planners in London, Washington, and Moscow was simple but profound. What should be done with these machines? The answers varied dramatically depending on which Allied power controlled them, where they were captured, and what technological secrets they might reveal. In the final weeks of the war, as German forces collapsed on both the eastern and western fronts, tank units received contradictory orders. Some commanders, still loyal to the Nazi regime, ordered their crews to destroy their vehicles rather than let them fall into enemy hands. In the forests of Bavaria and Austria, Panzer crews used demolition charges to blow turrets off their mounts, rendering the tanks useless. Others simply removed critical components like breech blocks and optical equipment before melting into the civilian population. However, many units chose a different path. Facing the reality of Germany's defeat and unwilling to sacrifice themselves in a lost cause, thousands of tank crews surrendered their vehicles intact. In Czechoslovakia alone, Allied forces captured more than 800 German armoured vehicles in various states of repair. The Americans found vast tank parks around Munich and Nuremberg, while Soviet forces seized enormous quantities of armour in eastern Germany and Poland. The British, advancing through northern Germany, discovered training facilities filled with tanks intended for crews who would never arrive. The Soviet Union, having borne the brunt of German armoured warfare on the Eastern Front, was particularly interested in captured German tanks. Soviet tank crews had faced Panthers and Tigers in brutal combat from Kursk to Berlin, and they understood the capabilities of these machines intimately. In the immediate aftermath of victory, Soviet recovery teams fanned out across eastern Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states, cataloguing every German tank they could find. The Soviets were methodical in their approach, establishing collection points where damaged vehicles could be assessed for repair or salvage. Unlike the Western Allies, who primarily saw German tanks as objects of study, the Soviets viewed them as potential weapons that could supplement their own armoured forces while factories retooled for peacetime production. Between May and December 1945, Soviet forces shipped thousands of German tanks eastward by rail, bound for proving grounds, training centres, and in some cases, frontline units in occupied territories. The Panther tank, designated as the Panzer Kampfwagen V, represented one of Germany's most successful wartime designs, and consequently, one of the most sought-after prizes for Allied intelligence. Developed in response to the Soviet T-34, the Panther combined sloped armour, a powerful 75mm gun, and decent mobility into a package that many historians consider the best overall tank of World War II. By war's end, approximately 6,000 Panthers had been produced, with several hundred falling into Allied hands in various conditions. The Western Allies immediately recognised the Panther's significance and began a systematic evaluation programme. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, American engineers subjected a captured Panther ISFG to exhaustive testing throughout late 1945 and early 1946. They fired the main gun repeatedly, analysed the armour composition, examined the transmission that had caused so many reliability problems, and documented every aspect of its design. The tests revealed that while the Panther's armour and firepower were indeed formidable, its mechanical complexity and fuel consumption made it unsuitable for American doctrine, which emphasised reliability and ease of maintenance. The British conducted similar evaluations at their testing facilities, with several Panthers preserved for detailed study of their optical equipment and fire control systems. In France, a curious chapter in the Panther's post-war story unfolded. The French army, desperate to rebuild its armoured forces after years of occupation, actively sought out usable German tanks. French recovery teams scoured battlefields across eastern France and southern Germany, collecting Panthers, Panzer IVs, and other vehicles. By early 1946, France had assembled enough Panthers to equip several armoured units, primarily in the 503rd Tank Regiment. These Panthers, repainted in French colours and designated as the Panther M10, served in occupation duties in Germany and even saw limited deployment to Indochina in 1946, though logistical difficulties and the lack of spare parts made them impractical for jungle warfare. The French continued using Panthers until 1950, making them one of the last countries to operate the type in active service. Some sources suggest that a handful of Panthers served even later in the French military as fixed fortifications along the Alpine border, their turrets removed and mounted in concrete bunkers. The irony of French soldiers operating German tanks, some of which had participated in the 1940 invasion of France, was not lost on contemporary observers. The Tiger Flamme, officially known as the Panzerkampfwagen 6, Tiger Ausf E, occupied a special place in both the German war machine and Allied nightmares. Only 1,147 Tigers were ever built, making each surviving example exceptionally valuable for study. These 54-ton behemoths, armed with the fearsome 80 mm KWK-36 gun, had established a reputation for near invulnerability in combat. Allied tank crews had learned to fear the distinctive sound of a Tiger's engine and the devastating crack of its main gun. After the surrender, every captured Tiger became a priority target for intelligence teams. The Americans seized Tiger 131, which had been captured by the British during the Tunisia campaign in 1943, and subjected it to months of testing. Engineers marvelled at the precision engineering evident in the interleaved road wheels and the massive Maybach engine, while simultaneously noting the vehicle's excessive weight and fuel consumption. The Tiger's armour, over 100 mm thick on the front, was analysed for composition and hardness, with samples sent to metallurgical laboratories for detailed study. These tests influenced post-war American tank design, particularly in the development of the M26 Pershing's successor designs. The British took a different approach to their captured Tigers. Rather than destroying them after testing, several were preserved for public display. Tiger 131, the most famous surviving Tiger Praim, eventually found its way to the Bovington Tank Museum in Dorset, where it remains to this day as the only operational Tiger Eye in the world. Its restoration in the 1990s involved sourcing parts from museums across Europe and fabricating components that no longer existed. The Soviet Union also captured numerous Tigers on the Eastern Front, with some pressed into service with Soviet units during the final months of the war. Soviet crews reported mixed feelings about operating Tigers. While the firepower and protection were appreciated, the mechanical unreliability and fuel consumption made them difficult to maintain in the field. After the war, several Soviet-captured Tigers were sent to the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, where they remain on display alongside other German armour, forming one of the world's finest collections of World War II AFVs. The Tiger II, or King Tiger, represented the ultimate expression of German heavy tank philosophy and simultaneously its fatal flaw. Weighing nearly 70 tons and armed with the long 88mm Climatic 43 gun, the King Tiger was the most powerful tank to see combat in World War II. However, only 489 were ever built, and mechanical problems plagued the type. Throughout its service life, the immense weight stressed the drivetrain beyond its design limits, and chronic shortages of spare parts meant that many King Tigers were abandoned by their crews after mechanical breakdowns rather than combat damage. Allied forces encountered King Tigers primarily in the war's final months, during the Battle of the Bulge and the defence of Germany itself. American troops found several intact King Tigers near the Remagen Bridge in March 1945, abandoned when their fuel ran out. The US Army shipped at least 3 King Tigers back to Aberdeen Proving Ground for detailed evaluation. The tests confirmed what Allied intelligence had suspected. While the King Tiger's armour and gun were extraordinarily powerful, the vehicle was a maintenance nightmare. The Maybach HL 230 engine, originally designed for the much lighter Panther, struggled under the King Tiger's massive weight. The intricate overlapping road wheel design meant that changing an inner wheel required removing up to 16 outer wheels, a task that could take a full day with the proper equipment. The Soviets captured approximately 60 King Tigers in various states of repair, with many found abandoned on rail cars or in factory yards. Unlike the Americans and British, who were primarily interested in technical intelligence, the Soviets saw potential military value in these monsters. Soviet engineers attempted to make several King Tigers operational, replacing failed components with Soviet-made parts where possible. At least one King Tiger is known to have been demonstrated for Soviet military officials in 1946, firing its main gun at captured German armour to showcase its penetrating power. However, the logistical burden proved too great, and by 1947, most Soviet-held King Tigers had been either scrapped or sent to museums. Today, only a handful of King Tigers survive in museums around the world. The most complete example sits at the Musée des Blindés and Saumur, France, captured by American forces in 1945 and later transferred to French control. Another resides at the Bovington Tank Museum, while the Kubinka Museum houses a King Tiger with the rear Porsche turret, one of only 50 produced before the design was replaced by the more common Henschel turret. The Panzer IV, Germany's most numerous tank with over 8,500 produced, had a remarkably long post-war career. Unlike the exotic heavy tanks, the Panzer IV was relatively simple to maintain and operate, making it attractive to countries rebuilding their armed forces. The Soviets captured thousands of Panzer IVs and initially used some for training purposes before scrapping most by 1950. However, it was in the Middle East that the Panzer IV found its most unexpected second life. Syria acquired a number of Panzer IVs from France and Czechoslovakia in the late 1940s and early 1950s, pressing them into service in their armoured brigades. These Syrian Panzer Pfeifferms saw combat during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, fighting against Israeli forces who were themselves using a hodgepodge of Allied and captured Axis equipment. The sight of German tanks fighting in the desert, just 3 years after the war's end, startled many observers. Some of these Syrian Panzer IVs continued in service well into the 1960s, primarily as fixed fortifications along the Golan Heights. Israel itself captured several Panzer IVs during various conflicts and incorporated them into their tank forces, despite the obvious irony of the Jewish state operating Nazi Germany's tanks. In Spain, which had remained officially neutral during the war but maintained close ties with Nazi Germany, approximately 20 Panzer IVs had been delivered in 1944. These tanks remained in Spanish service through the 1950s, with some reports suggesting that the last Spanish Panzer IV wasn't retired until 1967, making it one of the longest-serving examples of the type. The Spanish military modified their Panzer IVs over the years, replacing worn-out engines and updating the fire control systems. Bulgaria also operated Panzer IVs well into the post-war period, having received them from Germany during the war when Bulgaria was part of the Axis alliance. After switching sides in 1944, Bulgaria retained these tanks and used them as part of their military until the early 1950s, when Soviet T-34s became available in sufficient numbers to replace them. The Sturmgeschütz III, or Stug III, while technically an assault gun rather than a tank, deserves mention due to its prolific production and post-war use. Over 10,000 Stug IIIs were built during the war, making it Germany's most produced armoured fighting vehicle. The Stug III's combination of low profile, powerful 75mm gun, and relative simplicity made it highly effective in defensive combat. After the war, the Soviet Union captured thousands of Stug IIIs across Eastern Europe. Unlike the more complex Panthers and Tigers, the Stug III's straightforward design meant it could be maintained with minimal specialized knowledge. Soviet forces used captured Stug IIIs for occupation duties and training throughout 1945 and 1946. Syria and other Middle Eastern countries also acquired Stug IIIs, with some seeing combat in the early Arab-Israeli conflicts. Finland provided a unique case study in German armour preservation. Having received about 30 Stug IIIs from Germany during the continuation war against the Soviet Union, Finland retained these vehicles after the war and continued operating them until the late 1950s. The Finnish military valued the Stug III's low silhouette and good cross-country mobility in their forested terrain. Today, several Finnish Stug IIIs survive in museums, representing some of the best preserved examples of the type. But what happened to the thousands of German tanks that weren't preserved for study or pressed into service? The answer is both practical and somewhat melancholy. They were systematically destroyed or scrapped. In occupied Germany, Allied authorities faced a massive disposal problem. Hundreds of damaged tanks cluttered the landscape, many too damaged to move, all requiring disposal under the terms of the Potsdam Agreement, which strictly limited German military capabilities. The solution was large-scale scrapping operations. Throughout 1946 and 1947, Allied forces used explosives to break up tank hulls, which were then cut up with torches and sold as scrap metal. German companies, desperate for raw materials during the post-war reconstruction period, eagerly purchased this scrap steel for use in rebuilding industry. Ironically, steel from destroyed Panther and Tiger tanks likely ended up in post-war German automobiles and construction materials. The British operated massive scrapyards near their occupation zone headquarters, where specialised teams processed hundreds of vehicles per month. Panthers were particularly challenging due to their 45-ton weight and thick armour, requiring multiple explosive charges to break the hulls into manageable pieces. The United States military established similar operations, though they took a more methodical approach. American engineers photographed and documented each vehicle before destruction, creating an extensive archive of technical drawings and specifications. These documents proved invaluable for military intelligence and helped inform the development of American tanks in the early Cold War period. The M46 Patton, America's first truly modern main battle tank, incorporated lessons learned from German tank design, including improved armour layouts and more powerful guns influenced by the Panther's 75mm and the Tiger's 80mm weapons. At the massive tank depot in Grafenwöhr, Germany, American forces processed over 1,200 German armoured vehicles between 1945 and 1948. Each tank was stripped of useful components, optical sights, radios, machine guns, before the hulk was demolished. Some components were shipped back to the United States for study, while others were simply discarded as obsolete. The work was dangerous and dirty, with demolition teams frequently encountering unexploded ordnance inside the vehicles or dealing with the residual toxicity of ammunition propellant. The French took a more pragmatic approach to their captured German armour. While they retained functional Panthers and other tanks for military use, they also saw commercial potential in the captured vehicles. France operated a significant film industry, and German tanks proved popular for war movies throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. Several Panthers and Panzer IVs were preserved specifically for use as movie props, appearing in numerous French films about the war. This practice established a precedent that continues today. Many World War II films still use the few remaining operational German tanks for authenticity. The famous French film Is Paris Burning? Used several French-maintained Panthers, while later productions like Battle of the Bulge and Saving Private Ryan also employed actual German armour or carefully modified substitutes. The financial value of intact German tanks grew substantially over the decades, transforming them from scrap metal into valuable historical artifacts worth millions of dollars. In Czechoslovakia, a unique post-war industry emerged around German tank technology. The Škoda Works, which had produced tanks and components for Germany during the occupation, found itself in possession of substantial German tank expertise and equipment. After the war, under Soviet influence, Czechoslovakia began producing its own tanks based partially on German designs. The Czechoslovak military also inherited a large number of German vehicles, including many Panzer IVs and Panzer 38Ts, a design originally developed by the Czechs that Germany had adopted. These vehicles remained in service with the Czechoslovak army until the early 1950s, when Soviet tank designs became the Warsaw Pact standard. However, Czechoslovakia's experience with German tank technology influenced their own armoured vehicle development for decades, with Škoda engineers incorporating German transmission designs and suspension concepts into post-war Czech tanks. The Jagdpanther, one of Germany's most effective tank destroyers, met varied fates after the war. Armed with the same 80-aim Panther gun as the Tiger I, but mounted in a low-profile, heavily armoured casemate on a Panther chassis, the Jagdpanther combined stealth, firepower and mobility in a package that Allied tankers learned to respect and fear. Only 415 Jagdpanthers were produced before the war's end, making each surviving example relatively rare. American forces discovered approximately 20 Jagdpanthers in various depots across southern Germany, most in non-operational condition. The combination of battle damage, mechanical breakdowns, and deliberate sabotage by retreating German crews meant that few were actually capable of movement when captured. The Americans selected the best examples for shipment to Aberdeen Proving Ground, where they underwent the same rigorous testing as other German armour. Engineers were particularly interested in the Jagdpanther's gun mounting system and armour arrangement, which provided excellent frontal protection, while keeping the overall vehicle weight manageable at about 46 tons. The tests confirmed that the Jagdpanther was indeed a formidable weapon, but its lack of a rotating turret limited its tactical flexibility compared to turreted tanks. The British captured several Jagdpanthers during the final battles in Germany, including at least one nearly intact example discovered in a factory near Hanover. This vehicle was shipped to the United Kingdom for detailed examination at the Fighting Vehicle Proving Establishment. British tank designers paid particular attention to the Jagdpanther's sloped armour scheme and the mounting of the main gun, features that would influence British tank destroyer development in the immediate post-war years. The French also acquired some Jagdpanthers, though these proved impractical for service due to the lack of spare parts and ammunition. At least 3 French-controlled Jagdpanthers survived into the 1950s as training aids, with crews practicing engagement drills against these formidable tank destroyers to better understand their capabilities and vulnerabilities. Today, only a handful of Jagdpanthers survive in museums worldwide. The best example resides at the Fort Benning Armour Museum in Georgia, fully restored and occasionally started for demonstrations, while others can be found at Bovington, Somme, and Kubinka. The Elefant, also known as the Ferdinand, represented one of Germany's more controversial armoured vehicle designs. Born from a design competition between Porsche and Henschel for the Tiger I contract, which Henschel won, the Porsche chassis were converted into heavy tank destroyers mounting a powerful 80 mm gun in a massive superstructure. 90 Ferdinands were built and deployed to the Eastern Front for Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk, in July 1943. The vehicles proved devastatingly effective against Soviet armour at long range, but suffered from critical design flaws, particularly the lack of any defensive machine gun, which made them vulnerable to infantry attack. Of the original 90, only 48 survived Kursk, and these were withdrawn for extensive modifications. By war's end, very few Elephants remained operational. The Soviets captured several damaged Elephants at Kursk and near Berlin, carefully documenting their construction and capabilities. Soviet engineers were particularly interested in the Ferdinand's electric drive system, a unique feature derived from Porsche's automotive background. The massive hull and heavy armour impressed Soviet tankers. Though they recognized the vehicle's limitations in mobile warfare, American and British forces encountered few, if any, Elephants, as most had been destroyed or abandoned on the Eastern Front. Those that survived were converted to the Elefant variant with improved armour and a bow-mounted machine gun, and these served in Italy and on the Eastern Front until destroyed or captured. The Soviet Union preserved at least one Elefant at the Kubinka Tank Museum, where it remains today as one of the most imposing exhibits, its massive bulk and 88mm gun still capable of commanding respect more than 75 years after its construction. The vehicle's electric transmission, while innovative, proved too complex and unreliable for wartime conditions, a lesson that influenced both Soviet and Allied tank design philosophies towards simpler, more robust mechanical solutions. The lighter German tanks, particularly the Panzer II and Panzer III, received less attention from Allied intelligence services, but still played important roles in the immediate post-war period. These vehicles, obsolete by 1945 standards, were nevertheless useful for occupation duties and training purposes. The Soviets retained hundreds of Panzer IIs and IIIs for use in training exercises, where they served as opposing force vehicles, allowing Soviet tank crews to practice engaging German-style armour without expending newer Soviet equipment. The French also employed captured Panzer IIIs in their military, primarily in occupation duties in Germany and Austria. Some French Panzer IIIs were even shipped to Indochina in 1946, though like the Panthers, they proved unsuitable for jungle warfare and were quickly withdrawn. Bulgaria and Romania, both former Axis allies that switched sides late in the war, inherited substantial numbers of these lighter German tanks. Romania operated Panzer IIIs and IVs until the early 1950s as part of their armoured forces, while Bulgaria used them for both military service and as static defences. Turkey, which remained neutral throughout World War II while maintaining diplomatic relations with. Both sides conducted quiet negotiations with both the Allies and the Soviets in the war's aftermath to acquire German tanks. Through various channels, Turkey obtained approximately 30 Panzer IVs and a smaller number of Stug IIIs between 1946 and 1948. These vehicles supplemented Turkey's limited armoured forces and remained in service until the mid-1950s, when American military aid provided more modern equipment. The Turkish government was careful to avoid publicising their use of German armour, given the political sensitivities of the early Cold War period, but archival photographs confirm that German tanks participated in Turkish military exercises as late as 1954. The acquisition demonstrated the practical value of German armour to smaller nations seeking to build modern military forces in an era when new tanks were expensive and difficult to obtain. Switzerland presented another unique case in the post-war fate of German armour. Although neutral during the war, Switzerland had purchased several Panzer 38Ts from Germany in 1944, ostensibly for defensive purposes should the country be invaded. These tanks, delivered shortly before the war's end, remained in Swiss service through the early 1950s. Switzerland also acquired additional German equipment through various means in the immediate post-war period, including ammunition and spare parts scavenged from abandoned German positions near the Swiss border. The Swiss military conducted evaluations of captured German tank designs, particularly interested in the Panther's 75mm gun and the King Tiger's armour scheme. While Switzerland never purchased additional German tanks after the war, their wartime and post-war experiences with German armour influenced Swiss tank development, including the design considerations for the ultimately unsuccessful PS-58 and PS-61 projects. The impact of German tank technology on post-war Soviet design cannot be overstated. Soviet engineers had spent years fighting German armour, and they understood both the strengths and weaknesses of Panthers, Tigers, and other designs intimately. After capturing German tank factories and technical documentation, Soviet designers incorporated numerous features into their own vehicles. The T-54, which became the Soviet Union's main battle tank and one of the most produced tanks in history with over 100,000 built, showed clear German influence in its armour layout and gun design. The T-54's rounded turret and sloped armour echoed the Panther's protective scheme, while its 100 mm gun was developed partially in response to the need to defeat German heavy armour. Even more directly, the IS-3 heavy tank, unveiled in 1945, incorporated lessons learned from German heavy tank design, particularly in turret construction and armour angles. Soviet designers rejected some German approaches, particularly the complex interleaved road wheels and overly sophisticated transmission designs, favouring instead robust simplicity that could be maintained by conscript crews with minimal training. The Western Allies similarly absorbed German tank design lessons, though they approached the problem differently. American tank design in the late 1940s moved away from the Sherman's relatively light armour and modest gun toward heavier, more powerfully armed vehicles. The M26 Pershing, rushed into service in early 1945, represented the first American response to German heavy tanks, but its true successors, the M46, M47, and M48 Patton series, showed clear German influence. The 90mm gun mounted on these tanks was developed partially to counter German armour, while improvements in armour protection reflected lessons learned from examining Panther and Tiger construction. American designers ultimately chose a different path than the Germans, preferring medium-weight, highly mobile tanks over the super-heavy designs favoured by late-war German engineers. But the influence was unmistakable. British tank development followed a similar trajectory, with the Centurion tank, first produced in 1945, incorporating armour improvements and gunpowder, increases directly attributable to combat experience against German armour. The question of what to do with the human expertise behind German tank design posed interesting challenges for the Allies. Ferdinand Porsche, whose company had designed the Tiger I, Porsche, and the Ferdinand Elefant, was arrested by American forces in 1945 but never stood trial for war crimes. Instead, after a period of detention, Porsche was released and eventually returned to automotive design, founding the sports car company that still bears his name. Other German tank designers faced different fates. Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp, who played a crucial role in developing the interleave suspension system used on many German tanks, worked for the Soviet Union after the war, contributing to Soviet tank development before returning to Germany in the 1950s. Fritz Tott's organization, which had overseen much of Germany's armoured vehicle production, was thoroughly dismantled by Allied authorities, with its leaders tried at Nuremberg. However, many middle-ranking engineers and designers found employment in the reviving German industrial sector, or even with Allied nations seeking their expertise. The factories that produced Germany's tanks faced their own complex post-war fate. The massive Henschel facility in Kassel, which built Tiger tanks, was partially dismantled by Allied authorities under the terms of the Industrial Disarmament Agreements. Key machinery was either destroyed or shipped to Allied countries, particularly the Soviet Union, as war reparations. The Soviet dismantling teams were thorough and systematic, removing entire production lines and transporting them eastward by rail. Some of this equipment ended up in Soviet tank factories, where it was studied and occasionally incorporated into Soviet production methods. The Krupp works in Essen, which manufactured armour plate and tank components, faced similar treatment. British occupation authorities supervised the dismantling of weapons production facilities while allowing civilian manufacturing to continue. By 1948, most German tank production capacity had been eliminated or converted to peaceful purposes. However, the expertise remained, and when West Germany was permitted to rearm in the 1950s as part of NATO, many of the same companies and even some of the same engineers returned to tank production, this time building vehicles like the Leopard 4, under license from Allied designs. The preservation of German tanks in museums became a significant priority surprisingly early in the post-war period. Military historians and intelligence officers recognized that these vehicles represented important historical artifacts that could inform future military planning and preserve the material record of the war. The Imperial War Museum in London acquired several German tanks in 1945 and 1946, including a Panther and a Tiger I, directly from military authorities. These vehicles underwent minimal restoration, preserving them in essentially their as-captured condition. The decision to maintain battle damage and original paint schemes proved prescient, as later generations of museum curators realized the historical value of authentic, unrestored vehicles. The United States Army established its own armor collection at Fort Knox, Kentucky, later moved to Fort Benning, Georgia. American curators acquired examples of virtually every major German tank type, from early Panzer IVs to King Tigers, creating what became one of the world's finest armour collections. Soviet museums followed a similar path, with the Kubinka Tank Museum accumulating an impressive array of German vehicles captured during the Great Patriotic War. France's extensive use of German tanks in the immediate post-war period deserves deeper examination. Beyond the Panthers already mentioned, France also operated Panzer IVs, Sturmgeschütz IIIs, and various other German armoured vehicles. The French military designated these vehicles with the prefix Beute, meaning captured or booty. The Panzer IV became the Beute Panzer IV in French service, and some sources suggest that France had as many as 100 operational Panzer IVs by 1946. The French modified many of these tanks, installing French-made radios, replacing German optical equipment with French equivalents, and in some cases mounting different armament. The logistical challenges were substantial, as France had to manufacture ammunition compatible with German guns, while also maintaining increasingly obsolete German engines and transmissions. French ordnance depots established specialized sections dedicated to German equipment, staffed by French soldiers with German language skills who could read technical manuals and maintenance instructions. The practice of using captured German equipment wasn't unique to France, but the scale and duration of French use exceeded that of other Western, Allied nations. The role of German tanks in early Cold War training exercises proved significant and somewhat unexpected. Both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces used captured German armor in war games and training scenarios throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. American units stationed in Germany practiced anti-tank tactics against actual Panthers and Tigers, providing realistic training that no amount of classroom instruction could replicate. The psychological impact on young American tankers of facing a Tiger I, even one operated by friendly forces in a training exercise, helped maintain vigilance and tactical awareness. British forces in Germany conducted similar exercises, with some reports describing mock battles that pitted British Centurions against German Panthers in realistic terrain. The Soviets went even further, establishing dedicated opposing force units equipped entirely with German tanks. These units, known by various designations, operated captured Panthers, Tigers, and other German vehicles in large-scale exercises, simulating German tactical doctrine to challenge Soviet commanders and tank crews. The practice continued until the captured vehicles literally fell apart from wear and tear, at which point they were finally scrapped and replaced with modified Soviet tanks painted to resemble German armor. In Yugoslavia, which had successfully resisted Axis occupation through partisan warfare, captured German tanks played a curious role in the post-war military. The Yugoslav People's Army acquired approximately 40 German tanks of various types, including Panzer IVs and Sturmgeschütz IIIs, some captured during the war and others obtained from the Soviets after 1945. These vehicles served in Yugoslav armoured units until the early 1950s, with some reports suggesting limited use even later in the decade. Yugoslavia's break with Stalin in 1948 complicated their military supply situation, and German tanks provided a useful stopgap while Yugoslavia negotiated arms purchases from both Western and Eastern sources. The Yugoslavs were remarkably resourceful in maintaining these vehicles, fabricating spare parts locally and even manufacturing ammunition when supplies ran low. Some Yugoslav Panzer IVs were later converted into recovery vehicles or command posts, their turrets removed and the hulls modified for specialized roles. This pattern of extended use and creative modification characterized much of the Balkans, where smaller nations made do with whatever equipment they could acquire. The story of German tanks in the Middle East extends beyond Syria's use of Panzer IVs. Egypt acquired a small number of German armoured vehicles in the late 1940s, though exact numbers remain unclear. These vehicles, including at least one confirmed Panther and several Panzer IVs, were purchased through intermediaries from scrap dealers who had originally acquired them from Allied surplus sales. The tanks were shipped to Egypt via Mediterranean ports and incorporated into Egyptian armoured units. However, their service was brief, as spare parts were impossible to obtain, and the vehicles quickly succumbed to mechanical failures. By 1952, most, if not all, of Egypt's German tanks had been cannibalized for parts or simply abandoned. Israeli forces may have encountered some of these vehicles during the 1948 war, though documentation is sparse. The broader pattern evident here is that many nations sought German tanks in the immediate post-war period, attracted by their reputation and available at relatively low cost, only to discover that operational sustainability was impossible without access to spare parts and specialized maintenance knowledge. In Asia, the fate of German tanks took yet another direction. While Germany never deployed tanks to the Pacific Theatre, a small number of German armoured vehicles reached Asia through other means. Japan had received technical drawings and some components from Germany during the war. Through submarine transport and other covert means, part of the broader Axis cooperation in weapons technology. After Japan's surrender, American occupation forces discovered these materials and confiscated them, along with Japanese-built prototypes that showed German influence. More directly, Soviet forces transferred some captured German tanks to China in the late 1940s, supporting the communist forces in the Chinese Civil War. These vehicles, primarily Panzer IVs and Stug IIIs, saw combat in Chinese hands during the final campaigns against nationalist forces. After the communist victory in 1949, some of these German tanks remained in Chinese military service for several years before being replaced by Soviet-supplied T-34s and IS-2s. Today, at least one German tank, reportedly a Panzer IV, survives in a Chinese military museum, a testament to this obscure chapter of post-war tank history. The technical intelligence value of captured German tanks extended far beyond simple examination of completed vehicles. Allied teams seized vast quantities of technical documentation, blueprints, and manufacturing specifications from German facilities. At the WW2 engineering office in Berlin, American investigators found complete development files for virtually every German tank and armored vehicle, including experimental designs that never reached production. These documents provided unprecedented insight into German design philosophy and manufacturing techniques. The development history of the Panther, for example, revealed the intense time pressure German engineers faced in responding to the T-34 threat, and the compromises they made in transmission design that led to the vehicle's chronic reliability problems. Documentation on the Tiger II showed the evolution from the Tiger I, including abandoned alternative designs featuring different armor schemes and weapons. British intelligence analysts spent months translating and cataloguing these materials, which filled entire rooms at various Allied facilities. The Soviets similarly seized documentation from facilities in their occupation zone, with Soviet engineers carefully studying German approaches to everything from armor metallurgy to gun barrel manufacturing. The captured German armor also revealed troubling evidence of forced labor in tank production. When Allied investigators examined Panthers and Tigers in detail, they sometimes found scratch marks, hidden messages, or deliberately introduced defects that suggested sabotage by concentration camp prisoners and other forced laborers. French resistors who had been deported to work in German factories came forward after liberation with accounts of subtle resistance efforts, from loose bolts to improperly mixed paint that would accelerate corrosion. While these acts of defiance rarely resulted in catastrophic tank failures, they represented a form of resistance against the Nazi regime and complicated German quality control efforts. The FU. Investigation into forced labor in German tank production became part of the broader documentation of Nazi crimes, with some industrialists who employed slave labor later prosecuted at Nuremberg and subsequent trials. The human cost of German tank production, both in terms of Allied casualties inflicted by these weapons and the suffering of those forced to build them, added a grim dimension to the technical evaluation of captured vehicles. Perhaps one of the most unusual fates for German tanks involved their use in demolition training and weapons testing. Both the Americans and British used captured German armor as targets for testing new anti-tank weapons under development in the late 1940s. Panthers and Tigers, already damaged beyond repair, were positioned at various ranges and subjected to fire from experimental guns, rockets, and shaped-charge weapons. These tests provided valuable data on armor penetration and helped refine Allied anti-tank capabilities for the emerging Cold War. The British tested early versions of the Hesh, high-explosive squash head, round against Panther armor, while Americans experimented with various calibers and types of ammunition. Some tests were more prosaic, using German tanks simply as large metal targets for general demolition training. By the early 1950s, as newer Soviet tank designs became the primary concern for Western military planners, the emphasis shifted from studying German armor to developing countermeasures against Soviet vehicles. However, the data gathered from testing on captured German tanks remained relevant, as Soviet tank design had incorporated significant German influence. The environmental impact of thousands of destroyed tanks scattered across Europe raised concerns in some areas. In Germany itself, the massive scrap operations helped remove this debris, but in remote areas of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, destroyed tanks remained where they fell for decades. In the forests of Belarus and Western Russia, battlefield clearance teams working as late as the 1960s and 1970s still encountered German tanks, some containing the remains of their crews. These vehicles, often buried in mud or vegetation, presented complex recovery challenges. Soviet authorities generally left them in place unless they posed immediate hazards or obstructed development. Today, battlefield archaeologists and recovery teams still occasionally discover German tanks in Eastern Europe, preserved in swamps or buried in remote locations. Each find provides opportunities for historical research and sometimes for museum acquisition, though many are too deteriorated for meaningful preservation. In the realm of private collecting, German tanks achieved almost mythical status. By the 1960s and 1970s, as the generation that fought in World War II began to age, interest in preserving and collecting military vehicles grew substantially. German tanks, being relatively rare compared to the thousands of Shermans and T-34s produced, commanded high prices when they became available. Jacques Littlefield, an American collector, assembled one of the finest private armor collections in the world, including several German vehicles. His collection featured a running Panther, one of only a handful in private hands, valued at several $1 million. European collectors similarly sought German armor, with wealthy individuals and museums competing for the few available examples. The restoration of these vehicles became a specialized industry, with expert mechanics and fabricators charging substantial fees to return tanks to operational condition. The process could take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, involving sourcing impossible-to-find parts, fabricating replica components, and solving complex mechanical puzzles. The sound of a Maybach engine roaring to life after decades of silence became the holy grail for armor enthusiasts worldwide. The question of what became of the advanced prototypes and experimental German tanks captured at war's end fascinates historians and enthusiasts alike. Allied forces discovered numerous one-of-a-kind vehicles in various stages of completion at German testing facilities and factories. The Maus, Hitler's 180-ton super-heavy tank, existed in only 2 prototypes, both captured by Soviet forces near the Kummersdorf proving ground. The Soviets combined parts from both prototypes to create one complete vehicle, which they tested extensively before sending to the Kubinka Museum, where it remains the largest tank ever built. The E-series of standardized tank designs intended to rationalize German production in the war's final year existed primarily on paper, though some components had been manufactured. Allied engineers studied these designs with great interest, as they represented German thinking about future tank development. Some concepts, like simplified suspension systems and standardized components across different vehicles. Weight influenced post-war Allied tank design. The Jagdpanther, the heaviest armoured fighting vehicle to see combat in World War II at 70 tons, survived in very small numbers, with perhaps only a dozen or so completed before the war ended. American forces captured at least 2 Jagdpanthers, one of which eventually made its way to Aberdeen Proving Ground and later to the Fort Benning Museum, where it remains one of the collection's most impressive exhibits. The Hetzer, a small but effective tank destroyer based on the Panzer XXXVIII chassis, had one of the most prolific post-war careers of any German armoured vehicle. Lightweight, simple to maintain, and mounting a respectable 75mm gun, the Hetzer appealed to nations seeking affordable armoured vehicles in the post-war period. Czechoslovakia, where the Hetzer had been produced during the war at the Škoda works, continued manufacturing the vehicle after 1945 under the designation G13. Swiss military evaluations in 1946 led to a purchase order, and Switzerland acquired approximately 158 Hetzers from Czechoslovakia between 1946 and 1952. The Swiss designated them Panzerjäger G13 and incorporated them into their defensive military doctrine, which emphasized mobile anti-tank capabilities in mountainous terrain. These Swiss Hetzers remained in service until 1970, making them some of the longest-serving German-designed armoured vehicles anywhere in the world. Today, several Swiss G13s survive in excellent condition in Swiss military museums, representing remarkably well-preserved examples of German tank destroyer design. The logistics of maintaining captured German tanks in Allied service highlighted fundamental differences in military philosophy. American military doctrine emphasized interchangeability and standardization, with the goal that any soldier with basic training could maintain or repair standard equipment. German tanks violated these principles spectacularly. The Tiger I alone required specialized tools for maintenance, and many components were hand-fitted during assembly, meaning parts from one Tiger might not fit another without modification. The Panther's transmission required a level of mechanical expertise that few Allied tank crews possessed. When France attempted to operate Panthers in squadron strength, they discovered that maintaining even a dozen vehicles operational simultaneously required a disproportionate investment in spare parts, specialized mechanics, and workshop facilities. This realization reinforced Allied commitment to simpler, more maintainable designs in post-war tank development. The Sherman tank, often criticised for being inferior to German armour in one-on-one combat, could be maintained by crews with basic mechanical knowledge using standard tools. This reliability advantage meant that American armoured divisions could sustain higher operational readiness rates than German panzer divisions, even when equipped with technically superior vehicles. The psychological impact of German tanks extended well beyond their physical presence on the battlefield and into the post-war period. Allied soldiers who had faced Panthers and Tigers in combat carried those memories for life, and their accounts shaped both official military history and popular culture. The reputation of German tanks, particularly the Tiger, reached almost legendary status, sometimes exceeding the vehicle's actual capabilities. This phenomenon, known to historians as Tiger fever, affected Allied tankers throughout the war, with crews frequently reporting encountering Tigers when they had actually faced less formidable vehicles like Panzer IVs. After the war, when military analysts examined combat reports and compared them to German production records and unit assignments, they discovered that many claimed Tiger encounters were impossible, as no Tigers had operated in those areas. The psychological edge that German heavy tanks enjoyed influenced post-war military thinking about the importance of crew confidence and the potential value of deploying smaller numbers of highly capable vehicles rather than larger numbers of adequate ones. Captured German tank documentation revealed sophisticated damage assessment and repair procedures that influenced Allied practices. German tank recovery and repair doctrine was highly developed, with specialized recovery vehicles, like the Panther, designed specifically to retrieve disabled tanks from the battlefield. Allied forces captured numerous German tank repair facilities virtually intact, complete with specialized equipment for removing and replacing Panther transmissions, changing Tiger road wheels, and other complex maintenance tasks. American and British military engineers studied these facilities carefully, incorporating useful procedures into their own tank maintenance doctrine. The Soviet Union, which had developed its own effective tank recovery procedures through harsh experience, still found value in German approaches to modular component replacement and battlefield repair. Some captured German recovery vehicles remained in service with Allied forces for several years, particularly in the Soviet Union, where their capabilities exceeded available Soviet equipment. The fate of German tank crews themselves varied as widely as that of their vehicles. Many were simply repatriated after periods as prisoners of war, returning to a Germany devastated by bombing and occupation. Some former Panzer crews faced war crimes trials, particularly those who had served in units accused of atrocities against civilians or prisoners. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, for example, was implicated in several massacres, and some of its tank commanders were prosecuted. Other Panzer veterans quietly reintegrated into civilian life, rarely discussing their wartime service. A few wrote memoirs or cooperated with military historians, providing valuable first-hand accounts of tank warfare. Otto Carius, a Tiger ace credited with destroying over 150 enemy tanks, wrote Tigers in the Mud, one of the most widely read accounts of German tank combat. His book, published in 1960, provided detailed technical insights into Tiger operations and helped establish the mythology surrounding these vehicles. Former German tank commanders also assisted Allied military intelligence in the early Cold War period, providing briefings on Soviet armor capabilities based on their Eastern Front experience. The question of German technological superiority in tank design remains contentious among historians even today. While German tanks like the Panther and Tiger possessed undeniable advantages in armour protection and firepower, they were also mechanically complex, expensive to produce, and difficult to maintain. The Soviet T-34, often considered the best overall tank of World War II, achieved its success through a combination of adequate capabilities, mechanical reliability, and massive production numbers. American tanks similarly prioritized reliability and ease of production over maximum individual combat capability. The examination of captured German tanks after the war helped Allied engineers appreciate both the strengths and weaknesses of the German approach. The Panther's sloped armor influenced American and British tank design, but the Panther's troublesome transmission was explicitly rejected as a model. The Tiger's 88mm gun inspired development of more powerful Allied tank guns, but the Tiger's weight and complexity were seen as cautionary examples rather than ideals to emulate. This balanced assessment, informed by detailed technical examination of captured vehicles, shaped Cold War-era tank development on both sides of the Iron Curtain. In Scandinavia, both Norway and Denmark dealt with German tanks abandoned on their territory at war's end. German forces in Norway surrendered with substantial equipment stocks, including numerous tanks that had been stationed there to defend against potential Allied invasion. Norwegian authorities initially preserved some of these tanks for potential military use, but by 1948, most had been scrapped, with the steel sold for reconstruction purposes. Denmark recovered several German tanks from coastal fortifications and military depots. Some of these were displayed briefly in Copenhagen and other cities as symbols of liberation before being scrapped. Finland, as mentioned earlier, retained its German armour longer than most European nations, valuing the equipment's defensive capabilities in the context of the tense Finnish-Soviet relationship in the early Cold War years. Swedish military intelligence evaluated several German tank types that had either been interned in Sweden during the war or were examined through diplomatic channels after the surrender. Sweden's neutral status allowed them unique access to both Allied and Axis equipment, and Swedish tank designers drew lessons from both sides when developing post-war Swedish armoured vehicles. The impact of weather and environmental conditions on abandoned German tanks demonstrated the varying durability of different designs and materials. Tanks left exposed to the elements deteriorated rapidly, with weather sealing proving inadequate on many German designs. Panthers abandoned in Norway's harsh climate suffered severe corrosion damage within months, while Tigers left in the North African desert faced different but equally destructive environmental challenges. Allied recovery teams found that German tank radios and electrical systems were particularly vulnerable to moisture damage, with many captured vehicles requiring extensive rewiring before they could be evaluated. The Soviets discovered that German tanks performed poorly in extreme cold compared to Soviet designs, which had been specifically engineered for Russian winter conditions. This climatic weakness contributed to German failures on the Eastern Front and validated Soviet design choices that prioritized cold weather reliability over refinement. When Allied engineers tested captured Panthers and Tigers in varied climates, from the desert proving grounds in Arizona to cold weather facilities in Alaska, they confirmed that German tanks had been optimized for the moderate climate of Central Europe and struggled in extreme environments. The commercial exploitation of German tank designs through licensing and sales of technical data became a minor but notable post-war industry. Some German engineers who had worked on tank development during the war found employment with foreign governments seeking to develop their own armoured vehicle industries. Spanish engineers studied captured German tank documentation extensively when developing Spain's post-war armour program, though Spain ultimately produced vehicles that combined German concepts with Spanish manufacturing realities. Argentina, seeking to develop domestic tank production capability in the 1950s, hired several former German tank designers as consultants, though the resulting vehicles showed limited German influence in practice. The Brazilian army evaluated German tank designs when considering domestic armour production, but ultimately chose to license American designs instead. These various attempts to leverage German tank technology in foreign development programs generally yielded limited results, as the specialized industrial base required to produce German-style tanks didn't exist in most countries. And by the 1950s, tank design had evolved beyond the World War II generation of vehicles. The discovery of intact German experimental vehicles and prototypes continued for years after the war's end. In 1948, British occupation authorities discovered a forgotten warehouse near Hamburg containing components for several unfinished experimental tanks, including parts of the ill-fated VK-45-2H heavy tank design that competed with the Tiger II. These parts were catalogued and most were scrapped, though some components ended up in museums. Similar discoveries occurred in the Soviet occupation zone, where searching through bombed-out factories occasionally yielded unexpected finds. In 1953, American engineers investigating a former SS barracks in Bavaria discovered technical drawings for an experimental tank-mounted flamethrower system, complete with prototype components. These periodic discoveries, continuing well into the 1950s, provided ongoing insights into German weapons development and highlighted how much technology had been in development when the war ended. Each find generated renewed interest from military intelligence agencies and technical analysts, though by the mid-1950s, German tank technology from the war had been thoroughly superseded by new developments in both East and West. The role of photography in documenting captured German tanks proved crucial for both immediate intelligence purposes and long-term historical preservation. Allied military photographers systematically documented every significant captured vehicle, creating extensive photographic archives. The US Army's Signal Corps photographers alone produced thousands of images of German tanks, covering everything from overall views to detailed close-ups of specific components. These photographs served multiple purposes. They aided in writing technical intelligence reports, assisted engineers in understanding German manufacturing techniques, and provided training materials for Allied soldiers who might encounter similar vehicles in future conflicts. The British Ministry of Information maintained a similar photographic archive, with particularly detailed coverage of the advanced Type 40 Jas and 43 U-boats, and the Tiger and Panther tanks. Soviet military photographers were equally thorough, though their images remained classified for decades and only became available to Western researchers after the Cold War's end. Today, these photographic archives represent invaluable resources for historians, museum curators, and restoration specialists seeking to accurately restore surviving German tanks to their wartime appearance. The educational value of preserved German tanks in teaching military history and engineering cannot be overstated. Museums worldwide use these vehicles to illustrate the evolution of armoured warfare, the industrial capacity of World War II nations, and the human cost of mechanised combat. School groups visiting the Bovington Tank Museum in England can walk around Tiger 131, one of the few running Tigers in existence, and gain a visceral understanding of the vehicle's massive size and intimidating presence. The Imperial War Museum in London's displays a Panther next to a British Churchill tank, allowing visitors to directly compare design philosophies and understand why Allied tankers feared German armour. In the United States, the National Armor and Cavalry Museum at Fort Benning features an extensive collection of German tanks, including Panthers, Tigers, and less common vehicles like the Hetzer and Jagdpanther. These exhibits serve multiple audiences: veterans seeking to reconnect with their experiences, students learning about World War II, and armor enthusiasts fascinated by the technical details of these machines. Museum curators have increasingly emphasized presenting these vehicles in their historical context, explaining not just how they worked but also how they were used and the human stories associated with them. The technical literature produced by examining captured German tanks filled libraries and influenced a generation of military engineers. The US Army published numerous technical intelligence bulletins in the late 1940s, each focusing on specific aspects of German tank design. Report T9 analysed the Panther's transmission in exhaustive detail, while Report T15 covered the Tiger I's armour and armament. British military intelligence produced similar documents, with some remaining classified until the 1970s due to their revelations about Allied anti-tank weapon effectiveness. Soviet reports on captured German armour remained classified even longer, with many only becoming available to Western researchers in the 1990s. These documents reveal the systematic approach Allied engineers took to understanding German technology. Every component was measured, weighed, tested to destruction, and compared to equivalent Allied designs. The reports noted both successes and failures in German engineering, providing balanced technical assessments free from the wartime propaganda that had often exaggerated or minimized German capabilities. For post-war tank designers, these reports became essential reference materials, consulted whenever questions arose about armour layouts, gun mounting systems, or transmission designs. The symbolic significance of German tanks in post-war commemorations and memorials varied dramatically by country. In Germany, the presence of tanks in public spaces became a sensitive issue. Some communities erected memorials to German tank crews killed in the war, often facing criticism from those who saw such memorials as glorifying Nazi militarism. Other German towns deliberately avoided any public display of military equipment, viewing it as inappropriate given Germany's Nazi past. In former Allied nations, German tanks sometimes appeared in victory parades and war memorials, displayed as trophies of conquest. The Soviet Union erected numerous memorials featuring captured German tanks, particularly in cities that had been besieged during the war. Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, displayed several German tanks that had participated in the siege, serving as reminders of the city's suffering and ultimate triumph. In Western Europe, towns liberated from German occupation sometimes placed captured German tanks in public squares as liberation monuments, though these displays gradually became controversial as attitudes toward war memorials evolved. By the 1970s, many such displays had been removed or relocated to military museums, reflecting changing sensitivities about public displays of weapons. The authentication and verification of surviving German tanks became increasingly important as their value rose. By the 1980s, with German tanks commanding high prices in the collector's market, the question of authenticity became paramount. Is a particular Panther a genuine World War II vehicle, or has it been assembled from parts of multiple vehicles, or even fabricated from scratch using wartime blueprints? Tank historians and museum curators developed expertise in identifying authentic vehicles through serial numbers, manufacturing marks, and construction details. The process resembles art authentication, requiring deep knowledge of manufacturing practices, wartime modifications, and post-war alterations. Some vehicles have complex histories of assembly from multiple sources. The running Panther at the Seymour Museum, for example, was assembled from two different vehicles, one captured by American forces and one by the French, with the best components from each combined into a single operational tank. Is this authentic or a reconstruction? The question generates ongoing debate among purists and pragmatists. Museums generally prioritize preservation and education over absolute authenticity, accepting that some reconstruction is necessary to maintain vehicles in displayable condition. The development of tank warfare simulation and wargaming in the post-war period relied heavily on data derived from captured German tanks. When military analysts sought to create realistic combat simulations for training purposes, they needed accurate data on vehicle performance, armor penetration values, and other technical specifications. The extensive testing of German tanks provided this data, allowing the creation of mathematical models that could predict combat outcomes under various conditions. These early simulations, primitive by modern standards, evolved into the sophisticated computer-based training systems used by militaries today. The armor penetration data derived from firing tests against Panther and Tiger armor, for example, helped establish the baseline probabilities used in armored combat simulations throughout the Cold War. Enthusiast war games and board games also benefited from this data, with game designers consulting technical reports on German tanks to ensure their games accurately reflected historical capabilities. Games like Squad Leader and Panzer Blitz became popular precisely because they incorporated realistic technical data, making players feel they were experiencing authentic tactical challenges. The impact of German tank design on science fiction and popular culture proved surprisingly durable. The aesthetic of German tanks, particularly the angular, aggressive appearance of the Tiger and the sleek lines of the Panther, influenced designers of fictional military vehicles for decades. Science fiction films and literature often featured vehicles that echoed German tank design principles, from the mecha designs in Japanese anime to the combat vehicles in Western military science fiction. The Imperial walkers in Star Wars show clear lineage from German heavy tank philosophy, emphasizing heavy armor and powerful weapons over mobility. Video games set in World War II, or featuring World War II-inspired vehicles, consistently featured German tanks as iconic enemies or playable vehicles. The World of Tanks video game, played by millions worldwide, features detailed recreations of Panthers, Tigers, and dozens of other German tanks, introducing new generations to these vehicles' history and specifications. This cultural persistence reflects the lasting impact of German tank design on the popular imagination, ensuring that vehicles built in the 1940s remain culturally relevant more than 75 years later. The question of how many German tanks ultimately survived the post-war disposal process remains difficult to answer precisely. Estimates suggest that of the approximately 46,000 German armoured vehicles produced during the war, perhaps 200 to 300 examples survive today, in museums, private collections, and scattered battlefield sites. This represents a survival rate of less than 1%, lower than that of Allied tanks like the Sherman or T-34, thousands of which survive. The lower survival rate reflects several factors. Fewer German tanks were produced overall, most were destroyed in combat or deliberately demolished after capture, and many examples in Soviet hands were scrapped without documentation. The survivors are distributed unevenly across vehicle types. Panthers and Tigers, being more interesting to collectors and museums, survive in disproportionate numbers relative to their wartime production. Conversely, common vehicles like the Panzer II and Stug III are underrepresented in museum collections despite being produced in large numbers. This skewed survival pattern means that museum collections don't accurately represent the distribution of vehicles that German forces actually fielded during the war. Historians must account for this survival bias when using museum collections as primary sources. The restoration of German tanks to operational condition represents one of the most challenging tasks in military vehicle preservation. Starting with a hulk that may have sat in a field for decades, restorers must source or fabricate thousands of parts, many of which are unique to specific vehicle types. The Maybach engines used in Panthers and Tigers are particularly problematic, as few complete examples survive, and remanufacturing components requires specialized knowledge. Restoration can take years and cost millions of dollars. The restoration of Tiger 131 at Bovington took several years and involved fabricating new final drives, rebuilding the gearbox, and completely overhauling the engine. When the tank finally ran again in 2003, it marked the first time in decades that a Tiger had moved under its own power. The sound of the engine, the clank of the tracks, and the sight of the massive vehicle in motion provided an irreplaceable connection to history. Similar restoration projects have been undertaken for Panthers, with private collectors and museums investing enormous resources to preserve these vehicles. The expertise required for such restorations resides in a small community of specialists who have spent decades studying German tank engineering and developing the skills to repair and maintain these complex machines. The ethics of collecting and displaying German military equipment, particularly tanks marked with Nazi insignia, has generated ongoing debate. Museum curators must balance historical preservation with sensitivity to the victims of Nazi aggression. Some institutions display German tanks with educational materials that explicitly address the Nazi regime's crimes and the context in which these vehicles were used. Others focus purely on the technical and military history, avoiding broader political discussions. Private collectors face different considerations as their vehicles aren't subject to the same educational mission as museums. The display of swastikas and other Nazi symbols on restored vehicles raises particular concerns, with some countries legally restricting such displays. Germany itself has strict laws regarding Nazi symbols, even on historical vehicles, leading to complex situations where German tanks in German museums must be displayed with their swastikas covered or removed. These debates reflect broader societal discussions about how to remember and commemorate difficult history, balancing preservation of the historical record with sensitivity to those harmed by the events being remembered. The archaeological investigation of battlefields where German tanks were destroyed has yielded significant historical insights in recent decades. In Russia and Eastern Europe, battlefield archaeology teams have located and excavated numerous tank wrecks, recovering human remains for proper burial and documenting combat actions in unprecedented detail. These excavations sometimes reveal surprising findings. A Panther excavated from a Polish battlefield in 2016 still contained personal effects from its crew, providing poignant connections to the individuals who operated these machines. Ammunition remaining in tanks reveals what was being loaded at the moment of destruction, informing understanding of combat tactics. The distribution of tank wrecks across a battlefield helps reconstruct the flow of battle and verify or correct official accounts. Some excavated vehicles have been recovered for museum display, though most are too damaged for anything beyond documentation. The work is slow and difficult, requiring careful archaeological technique to preserve fragile remains and artifacts. It also raises ethical questions about disturbing war graves and handling human remains, with strict protocols governing such work in most countries. The continuing fascination with German tanks among military history enthusiasts has created a robust market for photographs, documents, and artifacts related to these vehicles. Original wartime photographs of German tanks sell for hundreds or even thousands of dollars, depending on rarity and quality. Technical manuals for Panthers and Tigers, when they appear on the market, can command similar prices. This commercial market has positive and negative aspects. On one hand, it encourages preservation of historical materials and makes them accessible to researchers and enthusiasts. On the other hand, it can lead to looting of battlefield sites and the dispersal of historically important collections into private hands, where they become inaccessible to scholars. Museums and archives compete with private collectors for materials, often at a disadvantage due to limited acquisition budgets. The rise of digital technology has somewhat democratized access, with many institutions now digitizing their collections and making them available online. The Tank Museum at Bovington, for instance, has digitized thousands of photographs and documents from its archives, allowing researchers worldwide to access materials that previously required travel to England to consult. The integration of captured German tank technology into early Cold War militaries took various forms beyond simple operation of captured vehicles. American tank designers incorporated sloped armor concepts learned from the Panther into the M46 and subsequent Patton tanks. Soviet designers, already familiar with sloped armor from their own T-34, still benefited from examining German implementation of the concept at different thicknesses and angles. The British placed less emphasis on sloped armour initially, focusing instead on improving gun performance and developing new ammunition types, though later British tanks showed increased attention to armour geometry influenced by German designs. Beyond specific technical features, the broader concept of the main battle tank, a single vehicle type combining the firepower of a heavy tank with the mobility of a medium tank, emerged partly from Allied analysis of German experience. The Panther attempted to be such a universal tank, though execution problems limited its success. Post-war tanks from all nations pursued similar goals with varying degrees of success, ultimately converging on the modern main battle tank concept that dominated Cold War and contemporary armoured warfare. The Marder series of tank destroyers, built on obsolete Panzer II and Panzer XXXVIII Turned chassis, represented German improvisation at its most practical. These vehicles mounted powerful anti-tank guns on lightly armoured open-topped hulls, creating effective tank killers from vehicles that were otherwise obsolete. Several hundred Marders survived the war in various conditions, captured by all Allied powers. The vehicles were generally considered too lightly armoured and vulnerable for post-war service, and most were quickly scrapped. However, some found use as training vehicles, where their open-top design allowed instructors to easily observe crew actions. The Swiss, always interested in defensive weapons for their mountainous terrain, evaluated several Marder variants, but ultimately declined to acquire them, judging the vehicles too vulnerable for their doctrine. A few Marders survive in museums today, representing an important but often overlooked category of German armoured vehicles. The Marder III, in particular, can be seen at several European museums, where it illustrates the German practice of adapting obsolete chassis to new roles, rather than designing purpose-built vehicles from scratch. The Nashorn, or Rhinoceros, another tank destroyer built on a modified Panzer IV chassis and mounting the powerful 80 Metiman Pak 43 gun, saw limited but effective service during the war. Fewer than 500 were built, and correspondingly, few survived to be captured by Allied forces. The Nashorn's combination of excellent firepower and minimal armour protection made it suitable for ambush tactics, but vulnerable in mobile combat. Allied evaluation teams were impressed by the vehicle's gun, which could defeat any Allied tank at long range, but noted the inadequate crew protection and height of the vehicle, which made concealment difficult. Soviet forces captured several Nashorns and used some briefly in combat during the final weeks of the war, appreciating the firepower while acknowledging the survivability problems. Most captured Nashorns were scrapped by 1948, though a few ended up in museums. Today, only a handful of Nashorns survive worldwide, with examples at Kubinka and at the German Tank Museum in Munster. These survivors provide insight into German tank, destroyer doctrine and the trade-offs German designers accepted in pursuit of maximum firepower. The recovery of tanks from the bottom of rivers and lakes across Europe has provided some of the best preserved examples of German armour. During the war's final chaotic weeks, German units often drove tanks onto ice-covered rivers in attempts to escape advancing Allied forces. Many broke through the ice and sank, remaining submerged for decades. The cold, oxygen-poor water environment preserved these vehicles remarkably well, protecting them from the corrosion that destroyed surface-exposed tanks. In the 1990s and 2000s, recovery teams began systematically searching European waterways for sunken vehicles. A Panther recovered from a Polish river in 2016 emerged in nearly complete condition, with much of its original paint intact and even personal items from the crew preserved. The tank went to a museum after conservation treatment. Similar recoveries have occurred in the Czech Republic, Germany, and the Baltic states. These underwater recoveries generate significant public interest and media coverage, with recovery operations sometimes televised or live streamed. Each recovery provides opportunities for archaeological study before the vehicle goes to a museum. The process is expensive and complex, requiring specialised diving equipment, heavy lifting gear, and careful conservation to prevent the vehicle from deteriorating once exposed to air. The Panzerkampfwagen Farm and II, Germany's earliest operational tanks, saw limited combat by 1945, but significant numbers survived the war in training schools and depots. These light tanks, armed with machine guns or small cannon, were obsolete for frontline service by 1941, but continued in secondary roles throughout the war. Allied forces captured hundreds of Panzer Is and Hetzer IIs, viewing them primarily as historical curiosities rather than intelligence priorities. Some were preserved for museums, while most were scrapped. The French, characteristically resourceful, found uses for captured Panzer Is and Tzavus in occupation duties and internal security roles, where their lightweight and ease of maintenance offset their minimal combat power. Some French Panzer IIs reportedly remained in service as late as 1954 in colonial territories. Spain, which had received Panzer IVs during the Spanish Civil War, continued operating them into the 1950s, making Spanish Panzer IVs some of the longest-serving examples of the type. Today, Panzer Is and IIs are reasonably well represented in museum collections relative to their wartime significance, with examples at most major armour museums. These early vehicles help illustrate the rapid evolution of German tank design from the light, thinly armoured Panzer I to the heavy Tigers of the war's later years. The propaganda value of captured German tanks was not lost on Allied governments. During and immediately after the war, German tanks featured prominently in newsreels, documentaries and propaganda films intended to demonstrate Allied military prowess. British Pathé newsreels showed captured Panthers and Tigers being examined by British soldiers, emphasising technological inferiority despite the vehicle's formidable capabilities. American newsreels similarly featured captured German armour, often showing US tanks alongside or even climbing over disabled German vehicles to emphasise American dominance. Soviet propaganda made extensive use of captured German equipment, with films showing Soviet soldiers and civilians examining destroyed Tigers and Panthers, often in elaborately staged scenes. These propaganda images, while historically problematic, documented many vehicles that were subsequently destroyed or lost, providing valuable historical records. The staging and manipulation of these images also offers insights into how each Allied power wanted to portray its victory and German military might. The long-term environmental impact of thousands of tanks destroyed or abandoned across Europe and the Soviet Union has received increasing attention in recent decades. Tanks contain various toxic materials: lead from batteries, mercury from instruments, oil and fuel residues, and explosive residue from ammunition. Tanks destroyed in combat often leak these materials into soil and groundwater, creating localized environmental contamination that persists decades later. Recovery and remediation efforts have addressed some sites, particularly in Western Europe, but thousands of destroyed or abandoned tanks remain in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, their toxic legacies still unaddressed. Environmental archaeologists working on battlefield sites now routinely test for contamination and take precautions when handling tank wrecks and surrounding soil. The discovery that some battlefield sites remain significantly contaminated has complicated preservation and commemoration efforts as areas that might otherwise be developed. As memorial sites require expensive environmental cleanup first, This environmental dimension adds another layer to the complex legacy of World War II armoured warfare. The role of German tanks in the development of anti-tank guided missiles deserves mention, though it extends beyond the immediate post-war period. The difficulty Allied forces experienced defeating German heavy tanks in combat motivated intensive research into more effective anti-tank weapons. This research, begun during the war, accelerated afterward with the availability of actual German tanks for testing. The first generation of anti-tank guided missiles, developed in the late 1940s and 1950s, was tested against captured German armour. The shape-charge warheads that make modern anti-tank missiles effective trace their lineage partly to German anti-tank weapons like the Panzer, thousands of which were captured and studied by Allied forces. Tests of these weapons against Panther and Tiger armour helped refine warhead designs and establish performance standards. The development of composite and reactive armour in response to shape-charge threats can thus be traced in part to the availability of German tanks for weapons testing in the post-war period. This technological chain, from German heavy tanks to modern anti-tank systems and countermeasures, illustrates how World War II armour continues to influence military technology decades later. The cultural memory of German tanks varies significantly across different national contexts. In Germany, public discussion of German military equipment from the Nazi period remains sensitive, with ongoing debates about how to remember this aspect of history without glorifying it. German tank museums carefully contextualize their exhibits, emphasizing the criminal nature of the Nazi regime and the suffering it caused. In former Allied nations, German tanks often appear in historical contexts that emphasize Allied victory and German defeat, though there's increasing recognition of the need for more nuanced presentation. In Russia and other former Soviet republics, captured German tanks serve as potent symbols of the Great Patriotic War and the Soviet Union's ultimate triumph over fascism. These different memory cultures affect how German tanks are displayed, discussed, and understood in different countries. Museum exhibits in different nations, even when displaying the same type of vehicle, tell markedly different stories about it, reflecting divergent national historical narratives and contemporary political concerns. Understanding these interpretive differences helps illuminate how material objects like tanks become invested with cultural meanings that extend far beyond their original military purposes. The question of whether preserved German tanks should be maintained in running condition or simply kept as static displays divides the museum and collector community. Advocates for running tanks argue that experiencing these vehicles in motion provides irreplaceable historical insight and public engagement. The roar of a Maybach engine, the sight of a 54-ton Tiger lumbering across a field, and the ground-shaking presence of these machines cannot be fully appreciated from static displays. Museums that maintain running tanks, like Bovington with Tiger 131, use them for public demonstrations that generate enormous interest and support for the museums. Critics counter that operating tanks causes wear and potentially irreversible damage to historically irreplaceable artifacts. Each time Tiger 131 moves, it experiences mechanical stress that brings it incrementally closer to catastrophic failure. The lubricants and fuels available today differ from those used in World War II, potentially causing unexpected wear patterns. The expertise required to properly maintain these vehicles may not exist in future generations, meaning that damage done today might be irreparable later. This debate has no easy resolution, as both positions reflect legitimate values and concerns. Museums must balance preservation, education, and public engagement, making difficult choices about how best to serve their missions. The international trade in German tanks and tank parts has evolved over decades into a complex, specialized market. In the immediate post-war years, German tanks could be purchased for scrap value, mere hundreds or thousands of dollars. By the 1970s, as their historical significance became apparent and surviving examples decreased, prices rose dramatically. Today, a complete restorable Panther or Tiger can sell for millions of dollars if one becomes available at all. This price escalation has made the discovery of previously unknown vehicles enormously valuable. When farmers or construction crews occasionally discover buried tanks, significant legal and financial questions arise regarding ownership. Most countries claim ownership of military equipment found within their borders, but disputes still occur. The parts market operates separately, with individual components from German tanks commanding high prices based on rarity and condition. An original Tiger road wheel might sell for thousands of dollars, while optical equipment or radio components can be even more valuable. This commercial value creates unfortunate incentives for looting of battlefield sites and illegal export of artifacts, problems that authorities struggle to control. The legitimate market exists alongside this grey and black market, with reputable dealers and museums competing with less scrupulous actors for access to rare items. The digital revolution has transformed how people engage with German tanks, even those unable to visit museums in person. High-resolution photographs, 3D scans, and virtual tours allow worldwide access to museum collections. Some institutions have created detailed 3D models of their German tanks, allowing users to examine them from any angle and even virtually disassemble them to see internal components. Video games provide interactive experiences with German tanks, from realistic simulations that attempt to faithfully recreate vehicle performance to more gamified experiences that prioritize entertainment over accuracy. YouTube channels dedicated to tank history have accumulated millions of subscribers, with videos about German tanks consistently among the most popular. This digital engagement introduces new audiences to these vehicles while raising questions about the relationship between virtual and physical historical artifacts. Can viewing a 3D scan of Tiger 131 provide meaningful historical understanding, or must one visit Bovington to truly appreciate the vehicle? These questions, which would have seemed absurd a generation ago, now require serious consideration as digital access increasingly supplements or replaces physical museum visits. The fate of German tanks in cinema and television deserves extended discussion, as these vehicles have appeared in hundreds of productions over the decades. The challenge facing filmmakers has always been the scarcity of actual German tanks available for filming. Early post-war films like A Bridge Too Far and Battle of the Bulge used a mixture of actual German vehicles and modified Allied tanks standing in for German armour. The practice of converting American M47 or M48 Patton tanks to resemble Tigers became standard, though the modifications rarely convinced knowledgeable viewers. More recent films like Fury and Saving Private Ryan benefited from increased access to restored German tanks and more sophisticated modification techniques. The production of Fury famously used Tiger 131 from Bovington, marking the first time a real Tiger had appeared in a major Hollywood film in decades. The insurance costs alone for operating the irreplaceable vehicle exceeded hundreds of thousands of dollars, but the authenticity it brought to the film was considered worth the expense. Television documentaries have similarly relied on surviving German tanks, with countless programs featuring the same vehicles from Bovington, Somme, and Fort Benning. This repeated filming of the same small number of surviving tanks means that audiences worldwide have seen the same individual Panthers and Tigers across dozens of different productions, an ironic form of immortality for machines built for destruction. The preservation challenges facing museums with German tank collections continue to intensify as these vehicles age further into obsolescence. The rubber components in tracks, road wheels, and seals deteriorate over time, even when tanks are stored in climate-controlled environments. Metal fatigue affects structural components, particularly in vehicles that saw heavy combat or have been moved frequently for displays. Museums face difficult decisions about whether to invest in expensive conservation work or simply accept gradual deterioration. Some institutions have adopted policies of preserved as found, maintaining vehicles in their as-recovered condition without attempting restoration. Others pursue active conservation, replacing deteriorated components with modern equivalents to keep vehicles displayable. The cost of these programs can be substantial, with annual conservation budgets for major armor collections running into millions of dollars. Funding these efforts increasingly requires corporate sponsorship and private donations, as government support for military museums has declined in many countries. The question of who will preserve German tanks for future generations and how remains open and somewhat troubling. The scholarly study of German tanks has evolved from purely military history into a multidisciplinary field, incorporating industrial history, material culture studies, and science and technology studies. Academic historians examine German tank production as a window into Nazi Germany's industrial mobilization and the regime's prioritization of military production over civilian needs. The use of slave labor in tank production has received particular attention, with scholars documenting the human cost of Germany's armored forces. Archaeologists study tank battlefield sites as complex material culture landscapes, where the distribution and condition of destroyed vehicles reveal patterns of combat and tactical decision-making. Engineers and metallurgists continue to analyze German armor and weapons, contributing to ongoing debates about the effectiveness of different design approaches. This scholarly work ensures that German tanks remain subjects of serious academic study rather than mere objects of enthusiast interest. University courses on World War II material culture often include modules on armoured vehicle design and production, using German tanks as case studies. The intersection of these various scholarly approaches enriches understanding of these vehicles and their place in history. The specialised knowledge required to properly restore and maintain German tanks represents an endangered skill set. The mechanics and engineers who worked on these vehicles during the war have nearly all passed away, taking irreplaceable knowledge with them. The next generation of tank mechanics, those who began working on military vehicles in the 1950s and 1960s, are now themselves elderly, and their knowledge must be captured and transmitted before it too is lost. Museums and restoration shops have attempted to address this through apprenticeship programs and detailed documentation of restoration techniques. Videos showing Tiger transmission rebuilds or Panther suspension maintenance serve as teaching aids for new generations of restorers. However, some knowledge may already be lost. The exact techniques German factory workers use to fit interleaved road wheels or properly timed Maybach engines may survive only in fragmentary form. Future restorers may need to rediscover through trial and error what was once routine procedure. This knowledge preservation challenge extends beyond German tanks to all vintage military vehicles, but the complexity of German armour makes the problem particularly acute. The field needs young people to commit to learning these specialised skills, but the combination of technical difficulty and limited career opportunities makes recruitment challenging. The story of specific, individually identified German tanks provides some of the most compelling narratives in post-war tank history. Tiger 131, captured by the British in Tunisia in 1943, has become the most famous individual tank in the world through its preservation and continued operation at Bovington. Its capture resulted from a lucky shot that jammed the turret without penetrating the armour, leading the crew to abandon an otherwise operational vehicle. For decades, it sat at Bovington as a static display before the decision was made to restore it to running condition in the early 2000s. The restoration required fabricating numerous parts no longer available anywhere, solving complex engineering problems, and training mechanics in long-forgotten maintenance procedures. When it finally ran again in 2003, it became a sensation, with demonstrations attracting thousands of visitors and generating worldwide media coverage. The tank has since appeared in the film Fury and numerous documentaries, and demonstrations of it running are among the most attended events at Bovington. Other tanks have similar, though less famous, stories. Panther 232, a vehicle captured by British forces in 1945 and now at Bovington, survived because a British officer decided it would make a good war trophy for the base he commanded. That decision, made on a whim, preserved one of the finest Panther examples in existence. The comparison between the fate of German tanks and that of Allied armour reveals interesting patterns. American Sherman tanks produced in enormous numbers survive in the thousands worldwide. Many countries operated Shermans for decades after the war, and the vehicle's relatively simple design meant they could be maintained with basic mechanical knowledge. Soviet T-34s followed a similar pattern, with thousands surviving in museums, as monuments, and in some cases still in service with Third World militaries into the 21st century. German tanks, by contrast, suffered from their complexity and rarity. Even countries that wanted to operate captured German armour found it impractical after a few years due to parts shortages and maintenance requirements. This practical disadvantage in service translated into lower survival rates in the long term. The few German tanks that survived did so because they were recognised as special, either for intelligence value, museum preservation, or later as valuable collector's items. This pattern means that surviving German tanks are generally in better condition than surviving Allied tanks, having been preserved, rather, than used until they wore out, but there are far fewer of them. The technological dead ends represented by some German tank designs offer cautionary lessons for military planners and engineers. The Maus, at 180 tons, the largest tank ever built, represented Hitler's obsession with bigger and heavier designs, taken to its logical extreme. The vehicle was so heavy that it couldn't cross most bridges and had to ford rivers using a snorkel system, a ludicrous solution that limited its tactical employment to virtually nil. Only 2 prototypes were built before the project was cancelled, demonstrating that there are practical limits to tank size regardless of armour thickness or gun power. The Maus represents a broader pattern in late-war German weapons development, where revolutionary but impractical designs consumed resources that might have been better spent on incremental improvements to proven systems. The Lion and E-100 super heavy tank projects followed similar logic, and none reached. Production before the war ended. Post-war tank design consciously rejected this approach, with even the heaviest Soviet tanks topping out around 50 tons. The modern main battle tank, weighing 60-70 tons, represents the practical limit for tracked armoured vehicles given current bridge and transport infrastructure. The lesson of the Maus and its super-heavy brethren, that more is not always better, continues to influence military procurement decisions today. The role of German tanks in perpetuating certain myths about World War II deserves critical examination. The Panzer myth holds that German tanks were categorically superior to Allied armour, and that German defeats resulted from numerical inferiority rather than technical or tactical shortcomings. This myth, promoted by some German veterans in their post-war memoirs and accepted uncritically by early popular histories, doesn't withstand scrutiny. While individual German tanks like the Tiger and Panther had performance advantages, in some situations they also suffered from critical weaknesses: mechanical unreliability, excessive fuel consumption, difficulty of repair, and vulnerability to breakdown. Allied tanks, particularly the T-34 and later Sherman variants, were better balanced designs that prioritized reliability and maintainability alongside combat performance. The systematic study of captured German tanks after the war helped military analysts understand these trade-offs and avoid the trap of pursuing maximum individual vehicle capability at the expense of overall force effectiveness. However, the Panzer myth persists in popular culture, reinforced by the impressive appearance of German heavy tanks and the dramatic stories of individual tank duels. Combating this myth requires continuous education about the realities of armoured warfare and the complex factors that determine military success. The diplomatic implications of German tank preservation and display occasionally surface in unexpected ways. When museums loan vehicles between institutions or when tanks cross borders for restoration work, questions of cultural property and historical responsibility sometimes arise. Russia's possession of numerous German tanks captured during the Great Patriotic War is generally accepted, but disputes have occurred over specific vehicles. Germany's request for return of certain vehicles from Russian museums for temporary display in Germany has sometimes been refused, with Russian authorities citing the vehicles' status as war trophies and symbols of Soviet victory. Similar sensitivities affect attempts to repatriate tanks to their countries of origin or manufacture. The question of who owns these artifacts, the country where they were built, where they were captured, where they now reside, or humanity generally as world heritage, lacks clear answers and must be negotiated case by case. These disputes, while usually resolved amicably, highlight the continuing emotional and political weight these machines carry more than 75 years after their combat service ended. The future of German tank preservation faces both challenges and opportunities. On the negative side, the passage of time continues to erode both the vehicles themselves and the knowledge needed to maintain them. Costs of conservation continue to rise, while museum budgets often face constraints. The generation with personal connections to World War II is disappearing, potentially reducing public interest and support for preservation efforts. On the positive side, new technologies offer preservation opportunities that didn't exist previously. 3D scanning creates permanent digital records of vehicles, preserving their exact dimensions and details even if the physical artifacts deteriorate. Advanced metallurgical analysis can assess structural integrity without destructive testing. New materials and techniques allow repairs that are less invasive and more reversible than previous methods. Growing international cooperation among armour museums means that knowledge and resources can be shared more effectively. The rise of crowdfunding and social media allows museums to appeal directly to enthusiasts worldwide for financial support. These tools provide hope that significant German tank preservation will continue for the foreseeable future, though eternal preservation remains impossible. Eventually, physical deterioration will claim even the best preserved examples, leaving only digital records and replicas. This inevitable endpoint makes current preservation work all the more important as we capture as much information as possible while physical artifacts still exist to study. The story of German tank development in the immediate post-war years in West Germany presents a fascinating epilogue. The 1955 Paris Agreements allowed West Germany to rearm as part of NATO, ending a 10-year period of enforced demilitarization. German industry was permitted to produce armoured vehicles again, though under strict Allied supervision. The first post-war German tanks were actually American M47 and M48 Pattens built under license, ensuring that West German armour forces integrated seamlessly with NATO standards. However, German engineers chafed at these restrictions and began developing indigenous designs. The result was the Leopard 1, introduced in 1965, which incorporated lessons learned from wartime German tank development while adopting a completely new design philosophy. The Leopard emphasized mobility and firepower over armor protection, reflecting NATO doctrine that prioritized offensive action over defensive warfare. While not a direct descendant of the Panther or Tiger, the Leopard showed clear German engineering DNA in its emphasis on precision manufacturing, quality components, and sophisticated fire control systems. The Leopard's success in export markets, with thousands sold worldwide, demonstrated that post-war German industry had retained its technical expertise in armour development. Many of the engineers who worked on the Leopard had cut their teeth on World War II-era projects, creating a direct link between wartime and post-war German armour. The emergence of German tanks as icons in model building and scale modelling communities has created a unique avenue for preserving detailed knowledge about these vehicles. Model manufacturers produce incredibly detailed scale replicas of Panthers, Tigers, and other German tanks, often based on detailed measurements and photographs of surviving vehicles. The most sophisticated models, at 1/35 or even 1/16 scale, include working suspension, detailed engines, and accurate internal layouts. Building these models requires understanding tank construction and operation in considerable detail, spreading knowledge about German armour to a worldwide audience of hobbyists. Model manufacturers commission detailed research into specific tank variants, production modifications, and camouflage schemes, generating reference materials that benefit academic historians as well as modelers. Some model companies have sponsored conservation work at museums in exchange for access to vehicles for measurement and photography, creating unexpected partnerships between commercial interests and cultural institutions. The model building community has also become a resource for restoration specialists, as modelers sometimes discover details about specific vehicles that aid in accurate restoration. This symbiotic relationship between modelling and preservation demonstrates how commercial interest in historical vehicles can support preservation efforts in unexpected ways. The literature on German tanks, both popular and academic, has grown to massive proportions since the war's end. Hundreds of books have been published on various aspects of German armour, from comprehensive technical studies to unit histories to personal memoirs. This extensive literature reflects sustained public interest in the subject, but also presents challenges. Early works, often based on incomplete information and uncritical acceptance of German sources, contain numerous errors that have been perpetuated through repeated citation. More recent scholarship, benefiting from access to Allied and Soviet archives and detailed study of surviving vehicles, has corrected many errors but doesn't always reach the same wide audience as earlier popular works. The result is a bifurcated literature where serious scholarship coexists with persistent myths. Readers interested in German tanks must navigate this complex landscape, distinguishing reliable sources from speculation and propaganda. Academic presses have published definitive technical studies of specific tank types, often running to hundreds of pages and featuring detailed photographs, technical drawings, and archival documentation. These works represent the current state of knowledge but require significant commitment from readers due to their depth and technical focus. Popular histories, more accessible but sometimes less rigorous, continue to introduce new audiences to the subject. The ongoing dialogue between popular and academic treatments helps refine understanding while maintaining broad public engagement. The economic impact of German tank tourism on museum budgets and local economies deserves recognition. Museums like Bovington Tank Museum in England, the Musée des Blindés in Saumur, France, and the German Tank Museum in Munster attract tens of thousands of visitors annually, generating significant revenue. These visitors often travel internationally to see specific German tanks, particularly rare or unique examples. The economic impact extends beyond admission fees to include hotel stays, restaurant meals, and other spending in the surrounding communities. Some towns have consciously developed tank tourism as an economic development strategy, promoting their museums and creating related attractions. Tank museums have responded by improving their exhibits, creating special events like Tiger Day at Bovington, where running vehicles are demonstrated, and developing educational programs that appeal to families and school groups. The success of these efforts demonstrates that German tanks, nearly 8 decades after the war's end, remain powerful draws for public interest and can contribute meaningfully to local and regional economies. This economic dimension provides pragmatic justification for preservation beyond purely historical or educational arguments, helping secure ongoing funding and political support for museum operations. The comparative analysis of tank preservation across different Allied nations reveals interesting patterns about national historical consciousness and priorities. The Soviet Union, and later Russia, maintained the largest collection of German armour, reflecting both the vast numbers of vehicles captured on the Eastern Front and Soviet interest in preserving material, evidence of victory over fascism. The Kubinka Tank Museum's collection includes numerous rare and unique vehicles found nowhere else, making it an essential destination for serious armour researchers despite sometimes difficult access conditions during the Soviet era and after. Britain's tank museums, particularly Bovington, emphasise technical development and engineering history, reflecting British cultural values around innovation and industrial heritage. The collections are comprehensive and well maintained, with extensive documentation and research facilities available to scholars. American collections, split between military museums and private collectors, reflect the American pattern of mixed public-private heritage preservation. The National Armour Museum at Fort Benning represents official military history, while private collections like the now dispersed Littlefield collection demonstrated what individual passion and resources could accomplish. France's Musée des Blindés at Saumur benefits from France's unique position as both a victim of German armour in 1940 and a post-war operator of captured German vehicles, creating a complex historical narrative that the museum navigates carefully. Germany itself maintains relatively modest armour collections, reflecting ongoing national ambivalence about military history from the Nazi period, though the German Tank Museum in Munster has developed into a world-class institution that contextualises German armour within broader historical narratives about warfare, technology and memory. The legal frameworks governing the export and trade of German tanks and military artefacts vary significantly by country and create a complex international regime. Most European countries regulate military artefacts as cultural property, requiring export licenses and sometimes prohibiting sales altogether. The United Kingdom's export licensing system, for example, requires that historically significant vehicles receive approval before, leaving the country with museums given opportunity to match private purchase offers. This system has helped keep important vehicles in British collections that might otherwise have been sold abroad. The United States takes a more liberal approach, treating tanks as collectible vehicles rather than cultural property, allowing relatively free trade subject only to weapons regulations that require removal or deactivation of armament. Russia prohibits export of most military artifacts, including German tanks captured during the war, viewing them as state property regardless of current ownership. These differing legal approaches create arbitrage opportunities and occasional conflicts. A tank legally purchased in one country may not be legally importable into another, complicating international sales and creating grey markets. The rise of online auction platforms and international collectors has made enforcement increasingly difficult as transactions can be arranged privately outside official channels. Museums and regulatory authorities have called for international cooperation on cultural property protection, but achieving consensus across different legal traditions and national interests remains challenging. The technical documentation produced during German tank testing after the war represents one of the most valuable but underutilized resources for historians and engineers. The reports produced by Aberdeen Proving Ground, the British Fighting Vehicle Proving Establishment, and similar institutions contain extraordinary detail on vehicle performance, including data that would be difficult or impossible to generate today, since it would require destructive testing of irreplaceable artifacts. These documents record exact armour penetration values at various ranges and angles, engine performance under different loads, transmission failures under stress testing, and countless other technical specifications. Much of this material remained classified for decades after the war, limiting access to researchers. Declassification has proceeded unevenly, with American documents generally more accessible than British materials, and Soviet documents still largely unavailable to Western researchers. The scattered nature of these archives, distributed across multiple institutions and countries, makes comprehensive research difficult. Some documents have been lost to deterioration, bureaucratic neglect, or deliberate destruction. Recent digitization efforts have improved access, but vast quantities of material remain available only in physical archives requiring in-person visits. Systematic cataloguing and digitization of these technical archives would benefit both historical scholarship and modern engineering, preserving knowledge about materials science, mechanical engineering, and weapons effectiveness that might otherwise be lost. The phenomenon of replica German tanks, built from scratch or heavily modified from other vehicles, raises interesting questions about authenticity and historical interpretation. Several companies and workshops specialize in creating running replicas of German tanks for film production, museums without access to originals, or wealthy private collectors. These replicas range from crude approximations to painstakingly accurate reconstructions built to original specifications. Some replicas use hulls from other vehicles as starting points, extensively modifying them to resemble Panthers or Tigers. Others are built entirely from fabricated components, using original drawings and specifications where available. The quality varies enormously, from obviously fake movie props to replicas so accurate that experts need close inspection to distinguish them from originals. These replicas serve useful purposes. They allow demonstration of tank operation without risking damage to irreplaceable originals, provide running vehicles for films when originals aren't available or are too valuable to use, and allow individuals to experience operating something very similar to a historic tank. However, they also create potential for confusion and even fraud. Unscrupulous sellers have occasionally tried to pass off replicas as originals, exploiting the difficulty of authentication and the high values involved. Museums have had to develop expertise in identifying replicas and clearly labeling them when displayed. The ethical questions surrounding replicas, whether they have historical value, how they should be presented to the public, and what role they play in preservation, continue to generate debate within the museum and collector communities. The cross-pollination between German tank preservation and broader historical memory has created interesting dynamics in how World War II is remembered and taught. Tanks serve as tangible connections to the past in ways that documents and photographs cannot, providing visceral, three-dimensional evidence of historical events. A student can read about. The Tiger tank's formidable reputation, but standing next to one in a museum conveys the vehicle's massive presence in a way words cannot capture. This material dimension of historical education has made tank museums important sites for public history and commemoration. School groups regularly visit armour museums as part of World War II curriculum units, with many students reporting that seeing actual tanks made the war feel more real and immediate than classroom lessons. Museums have developed sophisticated educational programs around their tank collections, including interactive exhibits, virtual reality experiences, and hands-on demonstrations. These programs serve diverse audiences, from elementary school children to university researchers, each taking away different lessons and understandings. The physical presence of German tanks in educational contexts raises pedagogical questions about how to teach about instruments of war and oppression. Most museums address this by providing extensive historical context, explaining not just how tanks worked, but how they were used and the human consequences of their employment. This approach treats tanks as entry points for broader discussions about technology, warfare, ethics, and historical memory, rather than as objects to be admired in isolation. The specialized publications and journals dedicated to German armor represent a vibrant subculture of enthusiasts, historians, and modelers who maintain intense focus on these vehicles. Magazines like Der Deutsche Panzer and English-language publications focus exclusively on German armor, publishing detailed articles on specific variants, unit markings, combat actions, and technical specifications. These publications serve as forums for ongoing research and debate, with subscribers contributing photographs, documents, and eyewitness accounts that expand collective knowledge. The editorial standards vary, with some publications maintaining rigorous fact-checking, while others publish more speculative material. Online forums and social media groups have supplemented traditional print publications, allowing real-time discussion and rapid sharing of discoveries. These communities have proven remarkably effective at identifying vehicles in photographs, tracking the fates of specific tanks through multiple owners, and solving historical mysteries through collaborative research. The downside of this intense specialization is sometimes an insular quality, where discussions become so technical that they exclude casual enthusiasts and the general public. However, at their best, these specialized communities preserve and advance knowledge about German tanks in ways that benefit academic researchers and museum curators, as well as fellow enthusiasts. The story of German tank recovery from the Eastern Front deserves special attention due to the harsh conditions and vast scale involved. The German-Soviet front stretched over 1,000 miles, encompassing terrain from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. Thousands of German tanks were destroyed or abandoned across this vast expanse, from the forests of Belarus to the steppes of Ukraine to the streets of Berlin itself. Soviet recovery efforts during the war focused on tactical needs, clearing roads, recovering salvageable equipment, and denying resources to the enemy. After the war, systematic recovery operations collected usable vehicles and scrap metal across the former battle zones. However, the sheer scale of the Eastern Front and the harshness of the climate meant that many destroyed tanks remained where they fell. In the Western Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, tanks destroyed in swamps or dense forests often sank into the terrain and became buried over time. Cold War tensions limited access to many of these sites, and recovery efforts were sporadic. Since the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, renewed access to former battle zones has allowed systematic recovery operations. Archaeological teams and commercial recovery groups have located hundreds of previously unknown tank wrecks, some remarkably well preserved by mud and cold water. These recoveries continue to yield new information about tank combat on the Eastern Front, and occasionally provide vehicles suitable for museum display after conservation. The work is difficult and dangerous, as many sites remain contaminated with unexploded ordnance, and the vehicles themselves may contain hazardous materials or even human remains. Each recovery requires careful archaeological documentation, explosive ordnance disposal, and environmental remediation before the vehicle can be safely handled and transported. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed learning about what happened to German tanks after World War II, make sure to check out our video about what happened to German U-boats after the war. The fate of these vessels shares many parallels with the tanks we discussed today, from systematic destruction to preservation for intelligence purposes to appearance in museums worldwide. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. We have dozens of videos covering the aftermath of the war, from the trials of Nazi leaders to the fate of various military units and equipment. Each tells a part of the larger story of how the world moved from total war to an uneasy peace. See you in the next one!